hope the applause will be as loud when I finish as at the very beginning, and that expresses the hope that I shall not disappoint your expectations. It is true, Temple Emanu-El is in fact the largest Jewish house of worship, not only in North America, but really in the entire world. It is soaring and awe-inspiring, but so in its own precious way is this sanctuary. It is truly a house of God. One feels it, and when I met your minister, I felt the warmth of affection and welcome, and it was so gloriously genuine. At the reception at the library about an hour ago, Peter Gilbert, who, by the way, is one of the great gems in Vermont today, truly one of the great gems. A man of extraordinary intellect, wedded to an extraordinary heart, and that is a magnificent confluence. Peter said, among his other remarks, that Vermont today needs, perhaps more than ever before, what it is that the Vermont Council on the Humanities does in fact offer. And you will see that implicit, I dare say almost explicit, in my conversation with you this evening, that is precisely the point that I will be trying to make. Now, by way of explanation, though it may seem otherwise for the first 4 or 5 minutes of my talk this evening, I want to reassure you that I am not abandoning the announced subject, which is words no longer used, a study in language and culture. I fear that without this momentary preliminary reassurance, you might easily conclude that some way, at some point along the road before this evening, I changed my mind and intended to talk about theology. Not at all. You will hear theology for the first 4 or 5 minutes, but only to demonstrate that the power of words was already present in the very genesis of Western thought, in ancient Judea, in classical Greece, in both religion and in its secular manifestations. And so, friends, now to the text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God said, "Let there be light." And God said, "Let there be a firmament." And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together." And God said, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation." And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament." And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of creatures." And God said, "Let the earth also bring forth living creatures." And God said, "Let the birds fly in the firmament." And finally, God said, "Let us make human beings in our image." So you see, from the very first paragraph of Scripture, Jewish religious thought postulates that creation itself is the consequence of words. For the reflective mind, both Jewish and Christian and Muslim, the manifestations of God in creation, in providence, in history, in revelation, are mediated not by anthropomorphic agents such as angels, but by the attributes of God himself, or if you prefer, God herself. But it's God's wisdom, God's word, God's power, to which existence is given. And by existence, I mean everything that we can know, touch, experience with our senses. In Platonic philosophy, that same concept is known as logos, which is the Greek word for word. John begins the writing of the fourth gospel under the influence of both the Hebrew Bible and Neoplatonic thought. He writes, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made." So you see, virtually identical. The Hebrew author, the Greek philosopher, and the gospel writer are saying that inasmuch as we human beings cannot comprehend God fully or completely, then we can only know God through that which the Creator has created. So it's always the Word, however differently interpreted, that is so critically central to the theologies of both Christianity and Judaism. Now, notwithstanding this somewhat long introduction, let me repeat. It is not theology about which I intend to speak this evening. Rather, it's about words. And I did the theology matter only to show how important words have always been in the canon of Western thought. So this evening, it's words that I want to talk about. Their importance, but specifically, I want to share with you thoughts about words that we no longer use. Now, it's inevitable that over the course of time, some words are going to get lost and are going to disappear from vocabulary. Now, that fact in and of itself may not seem terribly important, but it does assume a monumental significance if viewed from the perspective of what it means in the life of people. When words fall into disuse, it is only because something has happened to the ideas and the ideals that those words represent. My attention was attracted to this thought not too long ago, when for the first time since my undergraduate years, some 60-plus years ago, I found myself reading again John Gibson Lockhart's Life of Sir Walter Scott, a book I would suggest that ranks with Boswell's Johnson as one of the great biographies ever authored in our English language. Sir Walter Scott, in his letters and in his diaries, often used the word amiable when referring to family and to friends. His biographer, Lockhart, also used the same word frequently. Today, the word amiable is used, if it's used at all, to mean affable, good-natured, easygoing. Today, it's a rather light and shallow word, suggesting no particular depth of being. For us, an amiable person is someone kind of pleasant to have around, and that's about it. But in the days of Sir Walter Scott, the word amiable had dignity and beauty. It implied the presence of noble qualities. An amiable woman or man was loving. They were generous friends, hospitable hosts, devoted colleagues. They could be counted upon to sacrifice even their own interests for the sake of another. In emergencies, such people who were amiable would without hesitation lay down their lives for another. The English word amiable comes from the Latin word amo, which means to love. And that is precisely what we are in the process of losing in the practices of our time. We are not loving to the extent of our capacities. We've become afraid of sentiment and emotion. And that is why the word amiable has become so trivial and empty. We allow so little time for gracious courtesies. Why? Because we're all too busy making a living or pursuing a profession. Of course, in the hectic round of what we do stop for a moment here, there, now, then, to do a kindness, and that's well and good. But of course, you know it's implicitly understood, although unspoken, that the amiable attitudes of charity, of compassion, concern, must never really interfere with our principal objective, which is, of course, sadly, of course, the pursuit of our own self-interest. So how many today can it really be said that they are amiable in the old-fashioned sense of the word? And why is it that today, when one of us appears soft rather than hard, courteous rather than brusque, thoughtful of others rather than of self, we are tempted to sneer and dismiss such a person as either a weakling or a snob? Amiability has actually fallen to so low a level of appreciation that it's now thought to imply weakness, not nobility, least of all strength of character. And so the word amiable has become part of what is called our damaged phraseology. And now damaged, the word is cast aside and all but forgotten. So friends, this is what I now mean by a lost word and its significance. A word is a sign pointing to something else. That magical word, love. It's an abstract noun. There is no physical thing such as love. It's multidimensioned. And that word love points to a vast complex of human emotions and human relationships, in contrast to the word pulpit, or the word floor, or the word pew. So, what I'm really saying then is that when a word falls into disuse, it means that something has happened to that to which it had been pointing. The language we speak always reflects the lives we live. The two are not separable, and one doesn't suffer without the other. And so I should like to turn now to a small list of 5 words that we have lost or are in the process of losing. Amiable was the first word. A second was one of the noblest of all words when those of us who have already celebrated our 60th or 70th birthdays were young and in grade school. It was a word indelibly imprinted into our collective culture and our individual morality. It's a word that is today falling into neglect, stirring indifference, and on occasion, a contempt so profound that it arouses laughter. The word I'm referring to is duty. Duty as an obligation to do the right and a responsibility to love the good. Do you remember, you who are sitting here with the same kind of gray hair that I have and have had for a good number of decades, do you remember when you were in grade school, how you were encouraged to keep a quotation book in which you wrote down proverbs and maxims, great sayings and noble sentiments, which our teachers encouraged us to make a note of in our reading? And do you remember that in writing down those quotations, we were encouraged to memorize them? I remember that nothing stirred me quite so much when I was in the 7th grade, writing and memorizing, as these lines from Ralph Waldo Emerson, among the most familiar he ever authored. So nigh is grandeur to our dust, so near is God to man. When duty whispers, lo, thou must, the youth replies, I can. In those lines is an entire life philosophy, which is all but passed out of contemporary comprehension. Today, so many who came of age in the late 60s, who became the me generation of the 80s, and the narcissistic generation of the 90s, and the millennial folk of now our 21st century, don't think at all in terms of God, God's voice, as a divine imperative. Such things are dismissed as superstitions. For so many, there are few, if any, duties to fulfill. They claim to be free agents, free to do whatever they want. And what they want and what they will, often hidden beneath the loftiest banners of moral idealism, is to seek only their own pleasure and their own advantage. So there is little use for the word duty anymore, since there is so little reality in our moral life to which it corresponds. Consequently, the word duty is fast disappearing from our vocabulary. Vermont's 2 United States senators and its 1 singular member of the Congress are truly magnificent and unique in their commitment to duty. They understand the word duty, all 3 of them. But what of their many, many colleagues in the Congress today? Do they understand the word duty? One of the more important books of the 19th century was entitled The Duties of Man, written by Joseph Mazzini, the great Italian patriot and scholar who was critical to the formation of the modern nation-state of Italy. That book, The Duties of Man, was written as a kind of companion piece to our own America's Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, in order to prove that men and women have duties as well as rights, that the preservation of liberty depends upon the fulfillment of responsibility. But how often do people today think of duties and responsibilities? The fact that we can't even imagine such a book being written in our time or widely read, and the further fact that Mazzini's great masterpiece is all but forgotten, combines to demonstrate that for obvious and lamentable reasons, duty has become, or is fast becoming, a lost word. Today, the best sellers are self-help books, and that itself, I suggest, is a sad commentary on our time. Next in our list of lost words is discipline. A concept, I would suggest, that logically follows that which we have just observed about duty. Discipline is the process of learning skills, mental, physical, moral, without which an exalted life cannot be lived. Now, if anyone is going to acquire a skill, he or she has to do it and do it again and again and again and again, time without end, until at last it becomes as normal as breathing oxygen. If, for example, someone wants to learn how to play the piano, that person has to discipline herself or himself to years of drudgery at the keyboard. The great Paderewski practiced from 8 to 10 hours every day, and he used to say, if I miss 1 day of practice, I notice it, and if I missed a second day, my audience noticed it. The same is true of every art and every achievement, from the trapeze artist in the circus to the saint in his or her inner life and purity of heart. It is discipline, and only discipline, that brings victory. And the greatest discipline is self-discipline, and such discipline must be taught, and there's the rub. Discipline is out of favor today. It is argued by many educators and people in the healing professions that children must not be interfered with, that they must be free to follow their fancies like a bird is free to fly upon the wind. To direct or to control our children is to frustrate them. And that we are advised we must never do, because in the process we will be destroying their finer impulses of their natures. So we let too often our children run wild, with the result, riot in the nursery, confusion in the school, the unprecedented problems of adolescent misbehaviors. How foolish we are to deny our children the care, the training, and the direction which we so faithfully give to any plant in our garden. Yesterday morning, at our doorstep at our New York apartment, next week's edition of the New Yorker magazine arrived. And I looked at the cover, and I said to myself, my God, if this doesn't illustrate the point I'm now making. I know it's going to be hard for you to see. It shows a blonde-haired mommy, obviously with a child who is unseen, walking in Central Park. And in the first upper left, mommy says, go play, and be sure to climb the right way. And then she's looking, and she sees a child in the distance, and she says, glad that's not my kid. And then, oh my God, that is my kid. And with anger fuming, she calls out, get over here. And then suddenly, there mommy, the blonde, in the middle of Central Park, is standing face ashamed, because two other mothers are looking at her with almost contempt, as if, why are you abusing your child? So, in the next frame, we see mommy standing like this, saying, just tell me, why did you hit Timmy with a bucket? And obviously there's some kind of an answer, to which mommy says, even so, you can't go around hitting people with buckets. Go say you're sorry now. Then suddenly, in the same moment, she says, but darling, of course I still love you. More than a million, bajillion, squintillion universes. And then the unseen child says, Mommy, I want ice cream. Next week's edition of the New Yorker. The art of living is more difficult to learn than the art of dancing or singing or piano playing or painting. And yet we act as if we can acquire all of them without the rigor of discipline. And so the word discipline has disappeared from our vocabulary because we have abandoned so many of the values which once, like the steel frame of a building, were deemed necessary to sustain the structure of character. So the result is a diminution of much that made for former excellence. For example, and I love a great deal of modern contemporary music, but much of that contemporary music that we hear today is little better than a series of mechanical noises, because far too many of our contemporary composers have not disciplined themselves to a mastery of the classical forms. Not all. but a not insignificant amount of modern poetry is nothing more than awkward and ugly prose broken up into fragmented lines because so many of our poets feel the need to be free from the rigors of rhyme and rhythm. Not all, and I am a great admirer of a great deal of contemporary 20th century and 21st century art, but much of it is a return to primitive graffiti because artists in our time feel themselves superior to those very disciplines which made Michelangelo great and Raphael divine. And as for our moral life, it is more and more becoming a chaos of the inner spirit. Now, every age has had its young barbarians, and every generation the duty to turn them into civilized beings. But this we seem either unable or unwilling to do today. In this process of abdication, we've lost yet another word. The word cultured. It is true that we continue to speak of a nation's culture or the culture of a society. It's also true that we use the word culture more often than not with a prefix, subculture. Or in the late 60s, we began by using the term counterculture. Then we moved on to youth culture. And today we speak of aging culture. But we no longer speak with ease about the Renaissance person, the cultured woman, the cultured man. The cultured individual cultivated his or her inner life to a knowledge and appreciation of all the best that humanity has ever produced. West, East, cultured people were enlightened. They knew something of Greece and Rome, were familiar with the Bible, happy in the enjoyment of art and literature. Neither science, philosophy, nor history were strange to them. But they're strange to us. It's appalling to contemplate the intellectual bareness of so much that passes for modern life. How little we really know, and what is worse, how little we really want to know. Already 40 years ago, a study was commissioned by the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University, indicating that in the sample examined, and it was a diverse sample, it found that 80% of all college graduates were reading no more than one book a year. Cultural poverty starves the mind, just as famine starves the body. And surfing the net, as wondrous as it is, does not a cultured person make. Our inner life needs nourishment, and that nourishment is culture. And culture is not going to be found by Googling. Our greatest poverty is intellectual and spiritual malnutrition. The time in which we live is weak in much that makes for great thought and beautiful life. So in the passing of the word culture from our vocabulary, we are witnessing not only the demise of a word, but the simultaneous exit of a great tradition from the stage of history. And that, too, is a sadness. And what has happened to the word culture suggests what is happening or is happening to the fifth and final in this evening's list of lost words. I refer to the word righteousness and its antithesis, sin. On every page of the Hebrew Bible, on every page of the New Testament, on every folio of post-biblical Jewish literature and canonical Christian thought, on every page we find reference to a creating God, a righteous God who has authored the universe, and equally important, its corollary, that we, God's children, who live a righteous life, by so living, fulfill the basic reason for our having been created. And by living that kind of a life, we human beings, with the majesty of our rational capacity and the beauties of our heart, can in fact become a co-creator with the ultimate creator. So thus, in both Judaism and Christianity, we find a marriage that weds religion to morality. This has been, is, and forever will remain the great contribution of Christianity and its daughter Judaism, the unqualified affirmation that religion fulfills and justifies itself only in righteous living. But now has come a change over our minds, and the truth of the matter is that we find ourselves very often uncomfortable with righteousness, both as a word and as a concept. Now, it's true. Too many of us see far too much hypocrisy, and in truth, far too many so-called religious people are unadulterated hypocrites, wanting in character, failing in integrity. And so often their so-called piety often provides little more than a cloak beneath which to hide questionable and not so questionable behavior. But more significantly, and beyond the problem of hypocrisy, runs the deeper suspicion that our whole idea of righteousness might in fact be false. Not only do we question the righteousness of God, but we doubt the existence of God. I suspect that there are probably more doubters in the world today than there have ever been in the past. But of course, that might be attributable to the fact that there are more human beings on the face of the earth today than there have ever been in the past. But the fact of the matter is that the respective traditional systems, Judaism and Christianity, of ethics, based upon theological concepts of the absolute, have less and less standing anymore. The chorus, the large chorus out there, tells us that it all depends upon the situation. And so we have created in our time what we call situational ethics. Questions of right and wrong, good and evil, they're all relative, determined by accident and circumstance. Our moral judgments can be summarized with the phrase, "It all depends." Depends upon climate and custom. Depends upon environment and upbringing. Depends upon convenience and expediency. And what is right today can well be wrong tomorrow. In times of war, we do from sheer necessity and in the spirit of lofty patriotism what we would never think of doing or be allowed to do in times of peace. It would seem that the identification of the enemy makes all the difference, and that's wrong, even for those of us such as myself who are not unqualified pacifists. So we've turned from morals in much the same way that we've turned from religion, and that perhaps is really what is at the heart of our problem. If history teaches any truth, it teaches no truth more impressively that a civilization disintegrates with a loss of confidence corresponding to a loss of a distinction between right and wrong, good and evil, of course. Powerful economic and powerful political and powerful social forces all have their part in the rise and fall of nations, but nothing in the end is as decisive as the moral law. Let a nation, a people assume there is no morality, there is no ultimate being, there is no divine imperatives to obey, that righteousness is a myth and sin is a society's superimposed repression, that good and bad are superstitions. Let all those things be assumed, and over the future hangs nothing but the cloud of doom and destruction. So then, dear long-suffering people, these are the 5 words we've lost: amiability, duty, discipline, culture, righteousness. Oh, to be sure, there are many, many more words we've lost, but these 5, I hope, are sufficient to teach a truth. The truth that there are standards and there are values that are characteristic of the good life, that many of those standards and values have eroded significantly in our time. Words do not lose themselves, nor do they disappear without reason. When duty falls into disuse, discipline into neglect, righteousness into contempt, it means that something has happened in the very heart of our lives. So then, may I finally suggest, let each of us in our own way search our own hearts, probe our own souls, to see if that which we've lost we can maybe somehow find again. And if found, can we guard those words so that, like precious gems, they will not be lost again? Our words reflect our lives. May your life and my life be beautiful in amiability, noble in duty, steadfast in discipline, rich in culture, and finally, holy in righteousness. You've been wonderful, and I thank you for your patience. I was told that I had 50 minutes for the presentation. Looking at my clock, maybe I went over by 2 minutes. I've also been told that we have an additional 20 minutes for questions, and I will then, I've also been asked, would I repeat the question so that everyone can hear? But there are some young people among us, and if there are any questions among the younger people among us, raise your hand because I want to recognize you first. Okay, the question, thank you, that's a very important question. At the very end, asking how can we bring back those values individually? How then can we bring those words back, those ideas, those ideals, on a much larger arena? There's an old Chinese proverb. The first step in a march toward a 1,000-mile walk has to be taken. If there are enough people who commit themselves individually to sharing those ideas and living those ideas seriously, the effect can be profound. And I'm too old to look at life through rose-colored lenses in a naive kind of way. But I no longer want to live on this earth if I stop believing that an individual with the right intent, she or he can have a profound effect. Some of the most powerful bodies of water begin with little streams and mountains, and then they become more and more, gathering more water and rushing, and then they become a torrent. It happens in nature, and it can happen also in human nature. Will it happen overnight? Of course not. But it can happen if we will it to. Thank you for the question. I don't think that there is a given single moment. It may have begun with one of the most important revolutions in all of human history, and I'm talking about the Industrial Revolution that led to the technological revolution of our time, when the scientific method became part and parcel, and people began to think that the only things of value are those that are empirically verifiable, that we can, quote, prove with our minds and our senses. Now, those revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, based upon the emergence of the scientific method, have led to enormous possibilities of human freedom never before thought of, but in the process, so much that makes for the quality of life has been eroded, and it continues to erode. I think, of course, one could go back even further to the very end, possibly, of the Dark Ages, and the beginning of the Renaissance, particularly in Italy. So many of those forces are very difficult to particularly pinpoint at this moment in time. The fact of the matter is that most historical forces can't really be shown to that it was in this year, in this place, that such and such began. I don't know if the question is, the answer is adequate, but I hope so. There was a question, I think, right next to you. Yes. Oh, the infusion of new words into our vocabulary. Very, very important. New words are always incorporated into human language. For instance, when at the end of the 19th century, there was a renaissance of the Hebrew language, which had really been a language, biblical Hebrew, medieval philosophical Hebrew, and post-biblical rabbinic Hebrew. And then there came modern Hebrew, and there were no words for subways, airplanes, buses. So all those kinds of words, if one were to look at the Oxford Unabridged Dictionary in its first edition, and look at the most recent editions of the English language, there's a huge infusion of new words, except the new dictionaries don't really have the fullness of learning and reference to Greek mythology, to scripture that you find in the old great dictionaries. But those new words are terribly important. Life changes, people have to respond to life, and they have to create new words. So of course they're important. It's not just the old words, but it's the values to which those old words point as signs and symbols. And when there's a disintegration, that's what we lament. The world, and it is a splendid, thoughtful, sensitive question. The world has always known its barbarians. And the question is, do those who are victims allow themselves to be destroyed of their ultimate humanity by the barbarian, and if not becoming the barbarian in return and in response, then do you give up and say, why? What's the value of a life well lived if everyone who is victimized in whatever way were to spend the rest of her or his life with that kind of constant pain, disillusionment, skepticism, cynicism, the world would be far, far worse than it is today. Let me tell you a story about, if I may, the life of a remarkable rabbi, Rabbi Liobek, who was the chief rabbi of Berlin and one of the great exponents of liberal Jewish thought. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, he had an opportunity to get out and go to England. He had relatives living in England. He chose to stay with his people. Shortly thereafter, in an act of cynicism, Hitler himself ordered Rabbi Leobeck to become the head of the German Jewish community. It was a position without power, but it was a position that Hitler created to, again, try to fool the world. Rabbi Leobeck did whatever he could, and it was, in fact, very little. On several occasions, when the Gestapo came to his home to bring him to headquarters for questioning, he refused to go. In 1942, on the direct orders of Hitler, when the final solution had been put into place, Hitler ordered that Rabbi Beck be sent to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. And there he worked, and he said of himself, for the first time in my life, I know what it means, the phrase, to work like a horse. In 1944, late 1944, again on the direct orders of Hitler, Leo Beck was to be murdered. There happened to be another Dr. Leo Beck in the Theresienstadt concentration camp at the time, who was a dentist. And in their unusual, because they were usually very meticulous, the Nazis, they murdered the wrong Dr. Beck. Leo Beck survived the war and was liberated by the American and British troops. About a week after his liberation, an American reporter asked him during the interview, Rabbi Beck, how can you believe in God after you have seen and been part of such unadulterated barbarity? And Rabbi Beck, in a very gentle voice, said, God has given us free will. We have the choice. Otherwise, we would be puppets. And so, because we have free will, we can choose. The Nazis made the choice, not God. And I still believe in the ultimate goodness of the human being. Now, his saying that, coming out of that concentration camp experience, has a far greater authenticity than I, who at the time was a child living relatively safely in Cleveland, Ohio. So it is that kind of an authenticity that resonates in my being. But thank you for the question, a profound question. Are we talking about the love between two men or the love between two women? Are we talking about the love for one's country? Are we talking about a love for humanity? The point I was trying to make is about the word love. Whatever the nature of the relationship, outside of the intimacy and the immediacy of family relationships, whatever configuration that takes. It seems to me, and this was the point I made during the talk, that there is far too much fear of sentiment. Because if we're sentimental in expressing our love, we think, what's the matter with that guy? Is he a man? Our whole sense of manliness. Chivalry, at its very best, required courtesy and gentility. So much of that is gone. That's what I meant by the different kinds of love. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who still care, but I think today, whereas people in their intimate lives within their families, parent to child, grandchildren to grandparents, there may be beautiful sentimental expressions of love go outside of the family configuration, and that sentiment is suddenly non-present. That's what I meant. And perhaps even more egregious is that absence in the faculty of the humanities, more so than in the faculty of the sciences. When professors of literature and art history, fail to use those words, then it shows just how egregious is the absence and how profound the lack. I find it appalling, just as do you. So again, I thank you. Thank you. It was an honor, truly an honor. Thank you.